All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to unpack one of the most astonishing historical mysteries of the modern age. It's the story of a massive stolen empire. But we aren't talking about stolen land or stolen gold here. We're talking about a stolen cinematic legacy. We are looking at the literal architect of the narrative film industry, someone whose monumental contributions were systematically erased from the history books for nearly a century.
To really understand the scale of this erasure, I want you to think for a second and try to answer this question. Who invented narrative cinema? If you've ever taken a film history class or, even just watched a few documentaries, you probably have a few names already springing to mind. You might be picturing those early inventors tinkering with cameras back in the late 19th century, or maybe stage magicians creating visual illusions.
Right, and those names you're thinking of are almost certainly the accepted founders, guys like Thomas Edison, the Lumiere brothers, and Georges Méliès. But contrast those famous men with the forgotten founder, Alice Guy-Blaché. Because while those prominent men were largely capturing what were basically moving postcards, real-life scenes of trains arriving or waves crashing without any actual plot, Alice Guy-Blaché saw the medium's potential to actually tell stories. She was literally the first filmmaker to write fictional stories into her films, yet she's the forgotten founder, which really highlights a stark, profound injustice in how we recognize history.
Section 1. The Evidence. Building a Cinematic Empire.
Her career was moving at absolute lightning speed in the earliest days of film. And we aren't just making bold claims here. The physical proof of her foundational achievements is completely undeniable. Back in 1896, at just 22 years old, she directed The Cabbage Fairy, which is widely considered one of the very first narrative films in the history of cinema. Fast forward to 1906, and she directed The Life of Christ. Now, this wasn't just a short little clip. It was a 30-minute extravaganza featuring 25 sets, numerous exterior locations, and over 300 extras. And then, by 1912, after moving to the United States, she had built her own state-of-the-art production facility, Solax Studios, in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which, by the way, was the birthplace of the American film industry long before Hollywood took over. She oversaw all stages of production there, even jumping on a horse to go scout locations.
And she wasn't just churning out standard, run-of-the-mill movies. She was literally inventing the grammar of cinema as she went. She used close-ups for emotional depth, like in her 1906 film Madame's Cravings, where she zoomed in on a pregnant woman eating. She added hand-tinted color directly onto the film frames. Decades before the talkies even existed, she used a device called the chronophone to synchronize footage and sound, effectively creating the first music videos. It's wild. She also used primitive special effects and forced perspective. Actually, a technique she used to make Jesus rise above a crowd was a direct precursor to a visual trick they later used in the Superman movies. Plus, she tackled massive social issues, creating a 1906 satire where gender roles were completely reversed and directing a film in 1912 with an entirely black cast.
Her brilliant artistic philosophy was summed up in just 2 words: be natural. This was an actual sign she hung on the wall at her Solax Studios in New Jersey. At a time when actors were still using this overly dramatic, theatrical stage posing, she brilliantly forced her actors to abandon all that in favor of subtle, realistic human emotion. It was a direct message to her actors, and as she said later in life, it's all I asked of them. She wanted real life on the screen decades before other directors got the credit for moving cinema away from stage acting.
Section 2. The Cover-Up. Anatomy of an Erasure.
So, if her achievements were this massive, how does someone with this much influence simply vanish? Well, it wasn't an accidental oversight. It was a systematic cover-up that used 4 distinct institutional tactics. First, direct misattribution. As the early film history books were being written, her films were literally reassigned to her male assistants, like Louis Fuyare, leaving her with absolutely no visible body of work. Second, role diminishment. When they couldn't completely erase her, they just reframed her, calling the head of production a mere secretary who occasionally helped out. Third, omission. The very companies she helped build, Gaumont, completely left her out of their official company memoirs. And fourth, question competence. Later historians just assumed a woman couldn't have been technically proficient enough to direct films or manage a studio, and they used her manufactured absence to justify the continued exclusion of women in Hollywood for decades to come.
Okay, this part really hits hard when we look at her later years. After her studio was lost to bankruptcy and her marriage ended, she returned to France and later visited the US, frantically searching the archives for her own films. And she found nothing. Her entire career had basically vanished down the historical drainpipe. In the late 1950s, she wrote her memoirs to try and set the record straight, but she couldn't even get them printed. She lamented, "Nobody wants to publish them. It just doesn't interest anyone." She died in 1968 at the age of 94, before ever getting to see her own memoir published.
Section 3. Reclaiming the Lost Reels, the Modern Investigation.
Thankfully, that is not where the story ends. To understand what modern researchers were looking for, we really have to grasp the massive scale of the empire she built. 1,000 plus. That represents the total number of films Alice Guy-Blaché wrote, produced, or directed over her career. It is an absolutely staggering output, far, far greater than her contemporaries.
But then we have to look at this devastating number, approximately 40. Out of over 1,000 films, this is the tiny, tiny fraction of her life's work that actually survives today. It is a profound gut punch that illustrates the tragic reality of lost media. Much of her work was shot on perishable film stock that studios, frankly, just saw no profit in preserving.
So how did we even get those 140 films back? Well, it started in the 1970s, when feminist film collectives and historians began doing some really painstaking archival and forensic work, cross-referencing old studio records with private diaries just to prove her executive status. By the 2000s, this work finally culminated in major museum retrospectives at places like the Whitney and MoMA, which started screening her recovered works. And then in 2018, Pamela B. Green's documentary Be Natural, which was narrated by Jodie Foster, brought her untold story out of the shadows and into the mainstream, finally restoring her rightful place in history. Today, she even has a pillar in her name at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures.
So what does this all mean? The crucial point is this. Alice Guy-Blaché's story isn't just a piece of niche film trivia. It is a masterclass in how historical erasure functions. It forces us to look at the media, the technology, and the institutions around us today and ask a very uncomfortable question. What other voices have been systematically erased from the histories we take for granted? If the person who literally invented narrative cinema could be written out of the books for a century, who else are we forgetting? Keep that in mind the next time you watch a movie. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you're handed.